this whole issue. Vaping in Canada is relatively new. Vaping as an alternative to smoking cigarettes is relatively new. Probably, I would say not much more than a dozen years old. In Canada, vaping's been around for probably around 8 years. It really is, for all intents and purposes, Rajiv, the truest form of an alternative to smoking a cigarette. It is not a smoking cessation tool, so it does not fall under the aegis of nicotine replacement or nicotine replacement therapies. So it has a bit of a different look in terms of how you regulate this. The whole idea around vaping at the national level sort of came about when the Minister of Health at the national government, her name was Rona Ambrose at the time, had suggested that we should be doing something to regulate vaping in this country. So what she had done was she had written a letter to a committee of the House of Commons to look at this and said, come up with something that tells me I could regulate this. There's a committee in Ottawa, they call it the HESA committee, and the HESA had looked at this regime, and it had really stalled for a number of years. I'm really proud to say this, but the founder of the Canadian Vaping Association, the organization that really looks at this from a practical stakeholder relationship, is Sean Casey, who's here tonight. Sean took it upon himself to say, we have to do something because of the burgeoning the burgeoning market for vaping in Canada, and we have to have a coalescence of opinion, a coalescence of leadership, and so the Canadian Vaping Association was founded under his leadership. I'm really proud that he's here tonight. What had happened was the Canadian Vaping Association and another organization, the E-Cigarette Trade Association, had laid claim at the time, this would be now 4 or 5 years ago, that the Canadian government had said, I'm going to refer this to a committee of the House of Commons, and it really stalled. It had really stalled. But what they did say at the HESA committee was that there is a practical need for some kind of regulation of this marketplace. And let me just be very clear with you. To sell, up till this regulation or this piece of legislation had come into being, to sell a vaping product with nicotine was illegal because it had nicotine. And so what ended up happening was, in advance of some national piece of legislation, a lot of provinces, and I like to refer to it, Rajiv, as a mind-numbing siege, because we had gone down the path with the Canadian Vaping Association to deal with this issue, not only from Atlantic Canada, was like a domino effect across the country, where provinces, who also have the opportunity to regulate this, had said, we're going to go out in advance of what's happening at the national level to do our own regulation in the provinces. So Nova Scotia, and then Ontario, and then Quebec, and then British Columbia, and then Manitoba, and then Newfoundland, and then Prince Edward Island, and you could just go on and on and on. There are only 2 provinces that have not regulated vaping yet, and that's Alberta and Saskatchewan. But they're coming. But as all that was sort of laying itself out in terms of a regulatory process, the feds had changed party. The Sunny Ways had come in under this little boy, and we now have a government in Canada that's saying we want to look at a piece of legislation, and it was an amendment to an initial act under the Tobacco Act to put in place some kind of a legislative process under what they call S5, S standing for Senate, and 5 being the number in terms of the order paper. So S5 sort of became the national legislative order of the day. S5 really lays out under the Tobacco Act an amendment to have a category for vaping. Now, there are some people, and even some on this panel, who would argue that this is actually very flawed legislation. But if you look at what's happened worldwide, there's a move afoot through the World Health Organization and the Conference of the Parties to actually ban vaping outright. Canada disregarded that, and they said, we actually think that there is a necessity for having a category for vaping, and they put it in play. in Canada under Bill S5. So I think when you look at this in the context of where Canada sits in terms of its, I'm not going to call it leadership because there's a long way to go on this regime, but in terms of where Canada has gone, they could have said the same thing that many other countries did that signed on to the Conference of the Parties, COP7 in India in 2015 or 2016, I beg your pardon, to say we want to ban vaping, but they haven't done that. So we're looking at now a legislative process in Canada where it is now, if this piece of legislation passes, it will be legal to sell nicotine in the guise of a vaping product. So that's where we're at right now. There are, and I hope we get into this debate tonight, there are a whole host of issues because we do have a tremendous amount of concern with the manner in which a lot of this is being done. But from our perspective, and the perspective of the Canadian Vaping Association, this is an alternative to smoking cigarettes, and a viable alternative to smoking cigarettes. This is not a nicotine replacement therapy. It is not a health product. This is as I say, it lays the groundwork for those who wish to continue to have an alternative to smoking a cigarette.
Now, just as a follow-up to that, before we get into some other topics, Marc, we're in Ontario, so let me ask you an Ontario-specific question. Yeah. Ontario is currently pushing through Bill 174, which deals with cannabis and vaping, and I think there's 4 pieces of school buses and the motor vehicle act. So there's 4 pieces of legislation. It's going through a rapid pace.
Yes.
We're coming up to an election where the Liberal government doesn't look good for them in June. Where are we on that? What does it say about vaping, and what are your views?
Well,
what's Ontario
saying about it? Well, my views are pretty much irrelevant. I think the Canadian Vaping Association has some very large concerns with what's happening in the province of Ontario with respect to Bill 174. So I'll just contextualize that too. About 2 years ago, the province of Ontario actually led the charge out in advance of the feds to put in place some regulations and some legislation in this province around vaping, Bill 45. And we had, as the Canadian Vaping Association, we had played a very large role in not only negotiating with the government some of the things that we thought would be relevant to put in that legislation, but we actually were very, I'm going to say this, Rashid, we were very, we were influential in getting rid of the minister. And let me tell you, the minister, the associate minister at the time, she, doesn't matter if it's a he or she, but the minister at the time had suggested that it was probably more beneficial to vape marijuana or cannabis than it was to vape nicotine. And so that kind of stupidity, when you look at the messaging of this, really put her in a position to be, you almost wanted to scratch your head as to why she would even come up with these kinds of things. But they linked that, and it became a very bad issue for her, and we ended up lobbying the Premier's office to get rid of her, and we were very successful. And I'm very proud of the fact that we said we got to get rid of this minister, because we had discussions with folks in public health, we had discussions with CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in the province. We had discussions with other organizations who were very much interested in what was happening with an alternative to smoking cigarettes, because Ontario leads the charge in the country, and probably, I'm going to say, on continental North America with respect to very, very heady and very, very effective anti-smoking legislation. So here we are in that particular environment where you've got a minister making silly comments about the fact that cannabis could be smoked or vaped anywhere but not nicotine. When you look at this in that context, we thought we had a really decent opportunity to work with the government in terms of where they were going on the regulation, and they introduced amendments, and those amendments, and I think this is really important from historical context, the amendments were really draconian. So we had suggested that we want to look at maybe making some amendments to those regulations, and they heeded our advice, and lo and behold, we thought we were going to get some amendments, and then they introduced Bill 174. Bill 174 is one of those pieces of legislation that you just have to scratch your head. we don't understand it. As a matter of fact, we had a meeting today, Sean and Kareem, who's the chairman of the Government Relations Committee of the Canadian Vaping Association, with the lead and the Minister of Health's office in the province of Ontario, and she really didn't even understand the context in which they were writing some of the pieces of legislation on Bill 174. Rajiv, it's an omnibus piece of legislation, and I think David had suggested that it compromises 3 areas. It compromises health, it compromises the Ministry of the Attorney General because of cannabis and the Cannabis Act, and the Ministry of Transportation as it relates to whether you're impaired if you're caught under the influence of cannabis or maybe nicotine, who knows. But the point of the exercise is it is a very stupid piece of legislation from that perspective. It has the unintended consequence of driving a lot of what we've been working on in public with accreditation and certification and the kinds of good things that have been happening to drive it underground. And we've made that point very, very clear to the Minister's office, and this is the start, I think, of a very healthy dialogue that might see a whole bunch of changes to that piece of legislation going forward.
Great, and I think David will probably get into some of the weeds of that a little bit later as well.
Unquestionably he will.
Yeah. Doug,